Excellent!
What's up guys, welcome back to Paul's Hardware. This video is going to be part 2 of my 4-part kind of mini-series on how to build a computer from a beginner's perspective. In part 1, I built this computer for about $500. I have a full beginner's step-by-step guide, so click the card up there or the link down in the description if you want to check out that video, as well as lists of all the parts that I'm using today as well as back then. These parts here I'll be using to upgrade this system today, so I'm going to be going over how to upgrade a CPU, upgrade memory, upgrade your graphics card, add a system fan, as well as adding additional system storage. And then in 2 more videos coming up soon, I'll be going over the first things that I do after the system is built, as in installing Windows and getting everything configured the way I want it, as well as a comparison between the performance of this build right here, as well as the upgraded build once all these parts are installed. I have already tested the system as is, and I can say it's pretty impressive for the price, but I think we can do a little bit better. Let's run down the upgrade parts I'll be using for this little project. Now, if you were to buy these parts outright, as well as most of the parts from this system, at least the ones that aren't being replaced by these, it would cost you between $720 to $760 or so US dollars. That's not including a Windows license. I am maybe or maybe not including the price of the hard drives, because these are salvaged. I just have a couple different examples from old builds or old systems. So again, if you have an old 500 gig to 1 or 2 terabyte hard drive lying around, you can easily pop that into the system, save yourself 40 or 50 bucks. As for upgrading though, going from the easiest parts to upgrade to the more difficult parts, memory of course is simplest, just adding a second stick of memory. Beyond that, I'd say this stuff here is a little bit more difficult. The graphics card's pretty easy to pop in, and then we just need to connect the power connector. Fan we do need to mount to the side panel and then just plug in the 3-pin power. Hard drives need a power cable from the power supply and a SATA data cable from the motherboard, and then the CPU is what's going to be most difficult, simply because we need to remove the old CPU and then we're going to be dealing with some cleaning of thermal paste. But it's not all that challenging, especially if you are prepared. So apart from the original build that I have right there, and I'm going to be slightly disassembling, I have my accessories and tools from the original kit. My rubber mat to keep things safe on the surface I'm working on, scissors, and a screwdriver. From my motherboard accessories, I have a single SATA cable, the other one that came in the package, as well as all the screws and everything that came with the case accessories. Now, we won't be using these for today's video, but you should definitely have them if you're doing a system build. One is going to be a USB drive, just a small one. You need a minimum of 4 gigabytes. That's just to make our Windows 10 installer. I like having an external drive just to plug in and make sure everything that might be on the computer that we are changing or updating or upgrading is backed up, and making a system image is also a great way to get back on your feet. And finally, like it or not, we are going to need another computer, because we need something that's internet connected with a USB port in order to make our Windows 10 installer. Again, I'll be covering that in the next video, so stay tuned for it. Maybe hit the subscribe button if you want to be appraised when that one goes live. Finally, for our CPU removal and replacement, I have a kit here to deal with the thermal paste. Now, I have this stuff from ArcticClean for removing and cleaning the thermal paste and the thermal contact area. If you don't have that, you can use alcohol. I have 91% here. You want high percentage alcohol, but maybe not quite 100%. 100%'s a lot. I also have some stuff for cleaning the thermal paste. I like to use coffee filters if you have them available. If not, paper towels work just fine, just to make sure they don't get lint and fibers everywhere. Also, some Q-tips are very helpful for that. And of course, I need some replacement thermal paste for when we replace the CPU heatsink fan. So let's start off with the easiest upgrade. That's going to be system memory. I originally had a single 8 gig DDR4 DIMM in here. I chose that because the original motherboard I used had only 2 DIMM slots, and that would allow you to get 8 gigs now and then add 8 gigs later. If you are buying this system outright, I might consider going with a 2x4 gig kit to give yourself dual channel right out of the gates, or maybe just buy the 16 gigs right away. So what you need to be concerned about when you're upgrading memory is going to be making sure that the sticks are going to play nice together, and as long as you have DDR4, it should at least work at the minimum speeds, which is going to be just fine for a motherboard that you can't do overclocking with anyway, like this. You're not going to be able to access XMP settings on this, for example. So what I'm installing is just the second stick from my 2x8 gig kit. If you don't have a 2x whatever gig kit outright, then make sure you buy the exact same stick of memory once again. If that's not available, just make sure that at least, that it's DDR4, that it is the same capacity. So if you're adding another 8 gig stick, or if you're adding another stick, make sure it's another 8 gig stick along with that one, at least the ones that are in matched channels. And then finally, at least try to make sure that the speed is going to be equal. This one, for example, is 2666, but you might be looking at 2133 or 2400. The only other thing you have to worry about is double checking that manual to make sure that you're installing it in the right slots. Usually for dual channel capability, it's going to be every other slot, so it's pretty tough to get wrong. But beyond that, we're just going to install just like we did with the original system build by popping that latch out. Making sure once again that our notch is aligned, dropping that down straight and evenly, and then applying firm pressure on both sides to snap it into place. And ta-da! We have upgraded our memory. Next, let's install this case fan, and with a lot of budget cases, you will get a minimal amount of fans installed. That is the case with this case, which only came with a 120mm fan up front, which was, again, perfectly adequate for this system as is, with a dual core and a fairly low power, only drawing 75 watt GPU, since there's no extra power for this one. Only 75 watts is what it gets through the PCI Express bus. I digress though. Adding another fan will give us a bit of extra airflow for everything in here and keep everything a bit cooler, since we're upgrading to parts that will generate a little bit more heat. When we're adding a fan, we have to pay attention to airflow. So right now we have an intake in the front, and we have two other locations we can put a fan. A lot of cases will have fans at the top here. For this case has the power supply at the top. Sometimes the power supply is at the bottom, and you'll have some places for exhaust at the top. This one has a place back here, which would probably also be used for exhaust going out that way. This is a smaller fan mount though, I believe it's a 92mm, so I didn't want to put a fan there. Instead I'm going to add the fan to the side panel right here. So popping on this side panel, we can see it's got a 120mm mount right there. It is not filtered, so that is a downside. It is going to gather some dust right here, but we can clean it off fairly easily. And all I'm going to need to do is mount the fan via these 4 points on the 4 corners. Make sure it's oriented the right way. I want it drawing air in, pushing air into the case towards the GPU right there, and having the intake here and the intake here will create positive pressure inside the case with both of those intakes, and then the power supply at the top is going to be drawing and pushing some air out, as well as just air going out the back there because of the positive pressure. Just about any fan you buy should come with mounting screws. These are the standard fan mounting screws. They're a bit heavier or wider thread than the ones you typically use for computer cases, and those screws are actually meant to sort of dig into each corner of the fan that you mount it into. If you're not sure which direction your fan is going to spin or which direction the air is going to flow, look at the side of the fan. There will be often an arrow indicating. So that arrow is the direction that the fan's going to spin, that direction. And then that arrow is the way that the air is going to flow, so that way. If it doesn't have the arrows, almost always the bracket going across the back will be where the air comes out, or the exhaust, then the open side will be the intake where air goes in. And so with our fan mounted onto the side panel, all that is left is to plug in that other 3-pin fan header, and there's a fan header available for it just above the graphics card in there. I also want to point out that this adds another 25mm of thickness or so to the inside of this side panel. And if you look at our graphics card right there, you might notice that, well, it's not that it's out of space, but there is definitely less space there now than there was before. That is one of the limitations of this case, and one of the reasons why, if you're shopping for graphics cards to upgrade, make sure that although they can be longer this direction, that they are not taller in this direction. There are some thicker graphics cards like EVGA for the win and that kind of thing, which will not fit in this case, especially if you have a side fan installed as well. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of space is going to be this bracket right here, which is going to hold your couple drives. And I already have a 2.5-inch SSD mounted right up here to the top, but again, with a longer graphics card, which the GTX 1060 gigabyte version that I have definitely is, it's going to go out and again potentially conflict with drives that are right here. And with the gigabyte card, I also have to pay attention to the fact that there's going to be a power connector, which is going to be right down there, pointing out that way. So what I'm going to do is move that 2.5-inch drive down to the lower part of the bracket here, so it's a lot thinner than, say, the 3.5-inch drive over there, and I'll install the 3.5-inch drive up top, and that should give us enough clearance. But again, we're starting to see some of the limitations that you get with a more budget-oriented case like this, a $40 case. It is smaller and, you know, fits everything into a smaller footprint, but when you start expanding and adding stuff, you start to run out of space fairly quickly. And with that, we're down to our final three parts to install: CPU, graphics card, storage. But first off, just to point out, since I do have two mechanical hard drives right here, I'm only going to be using one of these. I'll do the 3.5-inch drive, since I think that's probably a little bit easier to come by if you guys are trying to use an older part. But of course, a 2.5-inch mechanical drive would work just as well, and would give you a little bit more room with that bracket across there at the same time. Anyway, we'll go with the 3.5-inch 2 terabyte drive. And honestly, if I was doing what should be done next, I would probably do the CPU upgrade, and then the graphics card, and then the drives. But since I said I was going to do the CPU last, I'll wait and do that last. For the graphics card, I just need to remove the old graphics card, same way that I installed it, by removing the two thumb screws here at the bracket, popping that little latch over, and then just sliding it out, which shouldn't take too much effort. Next though, I'll turn my attention to the power, and since I'm going to need power for a couple of these devices coming out, I'll just make sure that that's all set up and good to go. So the SATA plugs, these SATA power plugs from the power supply that I already used when I installed the 2.5-inch SSD originally, come on a little chain with 3 of them. So I'll keep using the one for the SSD. Actually, I'll probably bring that down to the lower end. Then I'll just use another one. I'll probably need to skip this one in the middle, and then use this third one to plug in the hard drive up there at the top. And then I'm also going to need to pull out this little bunch of cables and get a PCI Express power connector out of there. So the new graphics card is going to be going right in here, and it is quite a bit longer than the old graphics card. So one other thing I'm going to do here before I install that is get this serial ATA cable and plug it in for my second drive. Now my SATA ports are right down there. One's already plugged in. This one I can't really use because this plug has a right angle plug on one side, the 90-degree one right there, and there's not much to be done about that. So the right angle plug I'm going to use on the motherboard, and I'm just going to position that in one of these upper right facing slots, doing this one-handed. So again, bearing in mind that this is a L-shaped style plug, got to make sure it goes in the right way, and the latch on top is usually the case for this, so I'm just going to pop that in. Snaps into place. Now I am blocking the lower SATA port here, but since there's not enough space for more drives in this build anyway, or not really much unless I use those 5¼ inch bays at the top, I do have a couple more available right there, and if it really comes down to it, I would just need to change SATA cables to get one that didn't have a 90-degree plug on one end. And then again, we have this plug waiting for the hard drive on the other side. Next, I'm going to mount both of the drives to this bracket. I have repositioned these little rubber or silicone grommets up at the top. Those are specifically for mechanical spinning drives. They provide a little bit of sound dampening. Also, when it comes to mechanical drives, or well, any 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drives at all, you'll note that they have mounting points on the sides as well as on the bottom. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are your actual drive mount points for this one, and those should line up with the 4 silicone or rubber guys that I just put on there, and then they will mount through those little holes with these screws here, which are a little bit longer than your typical mounting screws. That's just to allow them to pass through the grommets, and again, a little bit of sound dampening, which is nice for a spinning drive. So I really should move on to the CPU at this point, but just to be clear where we're at so that we can sort of rest everything in here once we're good to go. Coming from the power supply up on this side, I have a 3 SATA power plug cable, that's for the 2 drives. I also have a PCI Express power cable that I'm only going to be using one of these plugs. I need a 8-pin for the GPU I have chosen, but as you can see, this would be able to handle 2 plugs if the GPU required that. And then finally, I've got 2 serial ATA cables also plugged into the motherboard here, and that's again for both of the storage drives. However, if I were to like install that there with this bracket over here, which actually is lining up okay, thankfully, just like that, so we can see that there is enough room, for example, over on this side of the drive so those plugs to actually plug in without conflicting like with that fan or anything. There's enough room there. But also once that graphics card goes in, once again, it's going to be like that, except over here. And as you can see, that 8-pin plug down on the end definitely needs some space like right in here. So that's going to be a little bit of a tight squeeze. But anyway, with all this good to install, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the CPU. Removal of a stock Intel CPU heatsink fan isn't all that tough. You do need a flathead screwdriver, so sorry I didn't include that in the accessories, but most people have that. If you look at these 4 mounting points, you'll notice that they have arrows on all 4 of them. That's actually for removal. So turn each in the direction of the arrow. It'll turn about a quarter turn. That will kind of disengage that little plug part at the very bottom, which pops through the bottom of the motherboard and holds everything in place. You of course do also want to remove that 4-pin CPU power. And then each of these little plugs will just kind of lift up a little bit. That'll disengage again that plastic piece that's poking through the bottom of the motherboard. With all those just kind of lifted, you should be able to just give it a little bit of a jiggle and lift it off. Now you'll notice it did stick just a little bit. That's because the thermal paste, once it gets hot, kind of melts up and makes good coverage over the top of the CPU. So our next step is going to be to clean that off, so when we reinstall a new heatsink fan, it will make good contact. We don't want any air bubbles or any old residue left in there. So if you're doing this upgrade from a Core i3 to a Core i5, you might take your old CPU heatsink fan and think to yourself, I can just reuse this, right? Maybe I'll just pop it back on there and then I'll have an extra heatsink fan. But I do not recommend that. For one thing, if you look just at the sizes of the boxes themselves, you might notice that one of them is slightly bigger. I thought that was going to indicate a significant difference between these 2 heatsink fans, but it wasn't really all that much. They are different though, even though they might look the same. They might look physically the same, they even look physically the same size. This one has a little bit more powerful fan. This one also has a different arrangement, at least for the aluminum fins going out there at the side. Some of them that are higher end will also have copper at the center, and that's just to allow for a bit of additional heat transference if the CPU is something that is more powerful or that is going to generate more heat. So always use the stock heatsink fan that came with the CPU you're installing. If that is the case, this is the 6500 and the one that came with it. And for the purposes of today's demonstration, even though this one did again come with pre-applied thermal paste, I'm actually going to clean this off and then I'll show you guys how to apply thermal paste if you're doing it from scratch or if you just don't have that pre-applied stuff on there. Well, let's uninstall this CPU so we can do all of our thermal paste cleaning at the same time. It's just the same process as installation was, but kind of in reverse. So again, lift that little lever arm, pull it back. The little closing latch down cover should lift up. Again, grab it by the sides. I find that's from the top and the bottom works best. And lift it off, being as careful as possible not to mess with any of those contact points down at the bottom. Now we will again take our new CPU, which is the exact same shape and size and everything like that. It just says 6500 on it instead of 6100. And of course it's quad core in there. Again, same procedure for the installation. Gold triangle at the corner, line that up with the gold triangle in the socket, drop it down in there. You've done this before. You're a professional at this point. Then we will close the lid, push that latch lever back down, back into place, and we're good to go. Now, if you're planning on reusing your old CPU or just storing it for a while or even returning it, it's definitely a good idea to clean the thermal paste off first. If you're using rubbing alcohol, just dump a little bit onto your coffee filters and then you can apply that to the surface. That works pretty well. I like this stuff from Arctic Clean though. You just put a couple drops onto the thermal material. Try not to spill it, of course. Rub that around a little bit and that'll kind of loosen everything up, break it up so it'll get absorbed pretty easily by the coffee filter. That'll get it mostly clean. And then they give you the thermal surface purifier, which you drop on after that, and that will make sure that everything's super cleaned off of there in order to prepare it for the next installation. Prepare that surface for thermal mating, which also sounds like hot lovin'. And finally, if you want to be really particular about things, that's where the Q-tip comes in, and you can use that to kind of just go along the edges, the grooves, so to speak, and get any of that thermal paste that might have gone over the side, making it look pristine, good as new. So again, ready for return, resale, handing down to somebody else or whatnot. Just again, make sure you hang on to the little plastic container that it came with, because that's one of the best places to store it. So our CPU is installed and ready to go. We have our heatsink fan, which does not have thermal paste on it. That is important, and we are going to apply our own. So I have my little tube here. This is just some stuff from EK. Most thermal paste is good. I don't know what to tell you. People ask me what kind of thermal paste to use all the time, and most of the thermal paste will work within a few degrees of each other. So all you want is a little blob right there in the middle. That was really fast, but there it is. I advocate something between a grain of rice and the size of a pea. About that much is going to be pretty good. That's actually a pretty good amount on there right now. That might be a little bit too much, but again, the blob in the middle will be spread out by the pressure of the heatsink fan. The heatsink fan, once again, we're going to line up Intel logo facing up. That's not really important, but if you can't do that, you might as well. And again, we're going to line up those 4 prongs on the bottom with the 4 mounting points on there. Also, you should sort of pay a little bit of attention to this cable hanging off the side. Sometimes they wrap it around and it can get caught in that little fan. Thanks for anyone who pointed that out in the comments on the build video, by the way. And we're just going to drop that straight down on top with that lined up. You will feel that thermal paste squish around a little bit, but we want to try to keep this as level as possible. And then again, starting with opposite corners, just put straight down and you'll hear it snap into place. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's nice and secure, and we're good to go. Oh wait, we also have to plug in the CPU fan header. So with the CPU installed, moving on to dropping everything back into place since we're pretty much good to go. Graphics card went in again, just like it did with the original build. It's just a little bit longer, but it snaps into place with the PCI Express slot. Latch at the bottom can slide over to lock it in place, and then 2 mounting thumb screws at the back of the computer to make sure it's secured. This 1060 does require extra power from the power supply, so here is our 6 plus 2 pin PCI Express graphics power connector. These will usually say PCIe on them, and they're the only 6 plus 2 pin type connectors. Also bear in mind there is a latch on one side. Sometimes it's on the top on the graphics card side, sometimes it's on the bottom. This one is on the top, and that latch will engage with this little latch right here on the plug itself. Of course, these final steps took a decent amount of finagling, just dropping this in, having that PCI Express power connector be routed properly. I had to kind of bend it over, but fortunately there's still a decent amount of clearance between the drive cage and that plug. The plugs for the storage drives themselves are kind of wedged up here at the front, but I was able to get that mostly over in here. There's some ugliness with cables down in that area, but you can't really see it. Unfortunately, everything in front of that main system fan for the intake is pretty clear, so it can drop air directly back for the CPU and the graphics card. Last little bit here is to install the side panel and hopefully plug in that 3-pin. See if I can do this with one hand. I did it! Yay! Now, normally we wouldn't put the side panel back on right now, but since we've already booted the system up once, it should be okay. So now I've come down to it once again, the moment of truth. Again. Oh yeah, power switch. It works! Hooray! Fans are spinning. I can even pop out the side panel here. You can even kind of see the Gigabyte LED logos on the graphics card through the side, which is super fun. That's a high-end feature that you wouldn't expect with something like the Fractal Core 1100. But guys, that's all for this video. I hope you have learned a little bit more about how to upgrade a computer, whether you're doing an upgrade immediately from the $500 build that I already showed you, or you're just looking for some tips on upgrading individual parts yourself. But I'm once again leaving you guys with a bit of a cliffhanger, which is that I've built the system, powered it on, and then said, cool, everything's fine. But where do you go from here? Should you go into the UEFI? Should you immediately start installing Windows? Thankfully, I have another video on that coming up very soon. If it's out, it'll be linked in the description. If it's not out yet, you'll have to wait just a few more days. It's going to be talking about first steps for getting the system configured properly, installation of Windows, and just some of the stuff that I do right off the bat. Thanks again for watching. Oh, and then finally, we'll have a comparison video where I do benchmarks and comparisons between the $500 version of this build and this version of this build, which would cost between $720 and $770-ish right now, depending on whether or not you're forking over cash for a brand new hard drive. Thanks again for watching this video though, guys. Hit the thumbs up button if you did enjoy it. Links again to all this stuff is down in the description below. We'll see you all next time.